And we will go live. All right, so now we are live on Twitch. I've been streaming on Twitch since last December. I started just with interviewing DJs and understanding how they are dealing with COVID, and with clubs and everything being closed down, and helping all the listeners and fans in there get to know the DJs better, because that's been one of the great benefits of having moved to Twitch, is now they actually get to interact with the DJs and learn a little bit about them. So now I get into like hour, 2 hour, 3 hour long discussions of really getting to know the DJs. And since that worked really well with just being really interesting, I decided kind of do that same thing with entrepreneurs and professors and others that are out there supporting entrepreneurship, especially focused on women and minority entrepreneurs. And I know you've done some work in that area, but before we get into all that, let's get some introductions in. And so,
absolutely,
Vivienne Ming, professional mad scientist. I love that. Co-founder of Socos Labs. All right. Yeah. Tell us a little bit about you.
Absolutely. So I am foolish enough to have started 6 companies. And one of them is noteworthy for the fact that people come to us with problems. I pay for everything and we give away all the solutions. So possibly the worst startup idea of all time is a claim to fame for me. I've had the chance to be the chief scientist of a few other companies, and I've gotten some pretty fancy smashy job offers for chief scientists at a variety of others that generally end with the response, "I'm sorry, but this will have to be another in a long line of terrible career decisions, but I don't want to be alone in a room with Travis Kalanick." That would be Uber. So I actually started my career as a theoretical neuroscientist. So I did my PhD work at Carnegie Mellon, and then I had a joint appointment at Stanford and Cal. Before my wife and I had our idea for my first tech company, an ed tech company, and boy, that got out of control, and I kind of got hooked. I mean, I love being a scientist. I would say my entrepreneurial career is essentially a long string of tricking investors into funding my experiments. And it turns out if you just keep paying them back, they keep falling for the same trick over and over and over again. So it's a pretty good life. And nowadays I get to fund my own crazy experiments. So I just thought I get this amazing opportunity to look out at the world and find things that are just simply wrong. A couple of weeks ago, a mother wrote me and said, my son, 8 months old, just had a stroke. What should I do? Mm-hmm. Years ago, I got an email from a mom saying my daughter has 500 seizures a day. Please save his life. And it just, these things come in, but then along the way, I built companies in education and in workforce and in healthcare. And so now I'll get, what should the UN do about AI ethics? Or what should the US Department of Labor do about economic inclusivity? And I get the chance to just walk in the door and be a professional pompous jackass. And it basically says, whatever you're working on, I probably have already been there. Not because I'm some genius, but just because I get to run out ahead of a lot of problems, because I have the flexibility of working on the problems I think are most important and just funding it all myself.
And you have a problem
giving it away. Yes, well, then, of course, you slowly build up this reputation as, the nut job that solves other people's problems. Again, boy, my product is much in demand it turns out there's an endless supply of problems in the world. What's amazing is how many people think that the problem, I am not a billionaire but want to be, is worth my time. That is a very common thing. I've got this great crypto idea for selling t-shirts. Boy, no you don't. One, and two, what could possibly make you think I am interested in helping you with that, even if it was a legitimate idea?
Right.
So, you know, this is me and my work. I still get to occasionally publish papers, but I probably read more economics papers nowadays than anything. And I get to write, as you can see from my posters behind me, a bit more publicly accessible stories about doing our research and what it might actually mean to have done the things that we've done. So probably a longer and more rambling answer to the please introduce yourself question than you're used to. But, you know, for me, it's really simple. I think there's an enormous untapped human capacity in the world. And when I say I think, there is. It's on a massive scale. It's well documented. I want my kids to grow up in a world where every other kid has the same opportunities that they do. And I believe in it so much, I'm willing to take nearly 100% of the obscene amount of money I make every year and put it towards that purpose. That's, you know, when I get asked by a lot of early career entrepreneurs, like, or just college grads, a very common question as I come off a stage maybe is, it's so wonderful that you found a sense of purpose in your life, Dr. Ming, but how do I find mine? And, you know, number one, you don't find it. It's not like there's just one thing buried somewhere and you need some magical purpose-driven treasure map to go find it. You get to build it yourself. You know, whatever you might think right now could possibly be it, that might be it. Just go, like, invest yourself in that.
Right. Try it out.
Yeah, but the other is, you know, and if you're thinking you're going to love it from day one, because boy, so much of the world has told you, find the thing you love or love the thing you're doing or whatever this is. I mean, who told you, where does this promise come from? That the thing you might truly be great at, that you might truly have a positive impact on the world through, you're going to love the moment you find it. I loathe programming. I am a filthy, filthy mouth sailor when I am writing any amount of code. But I've written a lot of code because that's part of my work, is figuring out how to make machine learning do something useful in the world. Something a lot better than what ad should we show this person, or what's a good go move. So, you know, building that sort of stuff requires you to just get comfortable. So the way I turn it around, in keeping with some of the things I've said already, is what are you willing to make a sacrifice for? And I don't mean a sacrifice that you will someday benefit from. Like, I got to work really hard because I want to win a gold medal someday, or I'm going to bust my ass at Harvard to get a great job. No. What would you do if no one ever learned that you were the person who did it, just because it should be true about the world that this thing happened? There's a old guy in India who's planting trees in front of an advancing desert. That desert's never going to come anywhere near his village within the span of his lifetime. He's just doing it because he wants there to be a village when he's gone. And if he didn't do it, then, I mean, even if he does do it, it may not make a difference. But this was something that he felt was worthwhile. I'm not saying everyone should live that life, but if you want to get a sense of what I mean by making a sacrifice, that's a great example.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So you talked about, you know, problems inspiring you. And, you know, so one of the earliest ones you had was your child with diabetes.
Yeah, you know, sorry, I'm pouring myself some hot tea, because what you really need on a sweltering California day is hot tea. But if I didn't drink it, I would fall over because I don't eat a lot during the day.
Well, I
I
got my
just,
coffee
it's
here.
not a diet. It's just, I've got back-to-back meetings all day long. This is my only calories that keep me awake. So, my son, I mean, even before the story I'm about to share with you, which kicks off in 2011, I'd had these experiences with, you know, when I was an undergrad. Well, I've been an undergrad more than once for reasons I don't know, we might talk about. But the second time around, I had these experiences with being able to build things that made a difference in people's lives, working on machine learning, for example, for cochlear implants, you know, algorithms that profoundly increase people's ability to understand speech, even though they are in fact deaf. So I've had this experience and kind of got hooked on it. I love being a scientist, but I also love being a scientist that builds things that actually directly affect people's lives. I can geek out with the best of them, talking about the, you know, wonky details behind the science, but you know, in a lot of fields, there's like 6 other people that can have a deep conversation with you about what you're doing.
Right.
And it's not a matter of no one else is smart enough. It's just who else would invest the kind of time to become that level of an expert in one single problem.
Yeah.
But I discovered I wasn't really that interested in one single problem. I was interested in being a dilettante that flips from problem to problem, and every time learn some new trick, some way of exploring the unknown that could immediately affect someone. And that served me pretty well come 2011. So my son is, oh my goodness, he just graduated from 8th grade. He is now 13 years old, and oh my God, he is an amazingly complicated kid. So back in 2011, he was just 3 turning 4. And you know, it was an interesting experience because it started, not that I understood that it started this way, but it started with this very little kid who'd been very well potty trained at an early age, suddenly seemingly overnight becoming a prolific bedwetter. And I must have been on Google every night trying to figure out what was going on. In retrospect, it seems obvious, and yes, we'll get to the punchline here. But you know, you wrap through that year and you come to November, or leading into you know, Thanksgiving in the US, and that Sunday beforehand he throws up in the bathtub. And if any of you have little kids, like, they've got all sorts of holes and all sorts of stuff come out of every hole, and sometimes the wrong things come out of different, I mean, they're gross. Little kids are gross. They're also amazing and they're cute, and but they're really clearly there's some sort of genetic trick to getting us to deeply invest ourselves in something that you know inevitably is going to pee and poop on you. And in this case, throw up on you. In this case, throw up in the bath, which is particularly, because it's everywhere. But whatever, this happens. So it's not a big deal. We don't think much about it. And he's still sick the next day. So, hey, we just give the pediatrician a ping. We're not the kind of parents that rush into the emergency room on a regular basis or ever, except we're about to. By Wednesday, he can't stand up. He's lost about 25% of his body mass. Wow. He's become delirious. And when we did rush to the pediatricians first before the emergency room, you know, because they said, all right, this is starting to sound weird. And by the way, it's actually a little strange that he's throwing up, but he doesn't have anything coming out of any of those other holes. Let's just check up on him. They didn't even need to run a test. They could just smell it. His sweat was sweet, which is because of all the sugar built up in his bloodstream. He had type 1 diabetes, which, if nobody knows, is an autoimmune disease, not as common as type 2, which is typically misrepresented as a kind of lifestyle disease. Type 1, your own immune system destroys the cells that make insulin. If you don't get insulin in your body, you will die. It's just as simple as that. I mean, we don't have family history of any kind, really took us by surprise, rushed to the emergency room. His blood sugar levels are literally off the charts. So I had one of the hardest physical and emotional days of my life, starting at the end of a day already. The next 24 hours, starting that night, we're on a cot next to him in the pediatric intensive care unit at the Oakland Children's Hospital. Not fun. I mean, the one thing I can say is we got to leave as a whole family, and that clearly was not the reality for a lot of families there, and that gives you all sorts of perspective. Whatever hardship I've experienced in my life, just the same as there's always someone smarter than you, there's always someone genuinely, legitimately that's had it harder. But still, it's my son, and it's hard. And, you know, it really blew me away. So we spend the whole Thanksgiving weekend there. Worst Thanksgiving ever. You know, hospital cafeteria version of a Thanksgiving meal is, it's got all of the right concepts, but as though they were only explained vaguely to someone that had never actually experienced it, and whose principal actual background was in cardboard box creation. So we have this thing, and I should get to the actual point here. That wasn't the most shocking part of my son being diagnosed with diabetes. That came about a month later. My wife and I are both scientists. We had spent the whole month collecting data about our son. We go in for our first outpatient visit with an endocrinologist whom I really liked, and they were mad at us for wasting their time. Instead, they gave us a sheet of paper and had us hand write 15 numbers, morning, afternoon, evening, blood glucose levels for 5 days. I must have had 15,000 numbers. Everything he'd eaten, weighed to the gram, the amount of protein, carbohydrates, and fats that were in it, his heart rate, measured via what nowadays we call a smartwatch, but they didn't really have a thing like that back then. Like, we collected so much data, and they wanted nothing to do with it. So I thought, and forgive me, I'm sure no one ever curses on Twitch, you gotta be fucking kidding me. Like, I build models of the brain. Are you truly telling me that the pancreas is more complex than the brain? Actually, it is exactly as complex, because of course they're all interconnected with one another. But still, it's just absurd that this was the state of things. In 2011, no, deep neural networks were not really a thing outside of science at that point, but still, the world was much advanced over handwriting and squinting, which is the standard treatment still at that moment. So I bought a book on endocrinology, and the next morning I hacked all of my son's medical equipment, broke all sorts of US federal laws, turns out, and I redirected the data flows out of his equipment and towards my personal server, where I used a model from my work in neuroscience to build a predictive model for blood glucose levels. Given everything we're measuring about him right up until this moment, what will his blood glucose level be 3 hours from now? And it turned out it worked. It wasn't easy to use. Probably the average family couldn't have used it because, again, we had to weigh everything and take copious notes, but we already were. Right. So a couple of scientists, we could collect that data. We could apply this algorithm. And in fact, I've got here, I think this is the third version of Google Glass. They had given me an early release pair when they were first coming out to come up with ideas of things that could be done with it. In the end, their big ideas was like, help with your golf game and share social media with your friends. Turns out no one wants to wear a fluorescent blue computer on their face so that they can tweet at their friends. Twitter is a thing that old people do to feel important. Your students have no idea. By the way, also, if you've never heard of it, a library is a historical building in which people store all of the information no one's willing to pay for. So I had this thing, and I thought, we've got this thing that predicts into the future. What if it predicted that he would go high blood glucose is bad for long-term health, or he'd go low glucose is the scary thing that might actually kill someone. And it just sent me a message. So an hour before it happened, I would know. So I'm actually at the White House meeting President Obama. Actually, President Obama at the time. I also met current president who was there. It was this swanky black tie event. By the way, Joe Biden, the biggest, whitest teeth of any human being I have ever encountered in my entire life. Honestly, I mean, he seems like a very nice guy, but it really stands out to you immediately. But so I'm there, and the crazy thing is the Secret Service wanted to kick me out of the White House because I was wearing a live camera on my head. It never even occurred to me. In fact, I'd asked permission ahead of time. Someone who clearly didn't know what they were agreeing to said yes. So I'm walking around with both the president and vice president in residence, out, greeting everyone at this party. And the White House throws a good party, I know, because my wife stole so many hors d'oeuvres. Like our purses were just overflowing with hors d'oeuvres. And this giant Secret Service guy comes up, and I thought, well, shit, they caught us. But it turns out he just wanted to tell us not to live stream the president. The reason I was doing this absurd thing was I got a real-time message. I was in Washington, D.C. My son was in San Francisco with my sister. And I got a message that said he was going to go low. I sent her a text message. She gave him some crackers. He didn't go low. I built myself a superpower. And yeah, if I've got a superpower, I don't care if I look like a jackass in front of Barack Obama. And let me tell you, he decided instead of kicking me out, because the Secret Service asked him if he could, he decided he wanted to meet me instead. He thought I was a crazy person. I mean, he walked up to me, literally walked up to me and just shook his head. That was his first words to me, with just a silent head shake of like, Jesus, lady, get yourself together here. This is a party at the White House. But I got to tell him what I was doing. And, it was an amazing thing. Again, if those of you that have a kid, just imagine being the one person in the world, not because you're some astonishing genius, just for, the combination of the terrible luck and the amazing luck to be that one person that could build a thing that would make a difference in your child's life, your sick child's life. You could build your own little superpower to help make them well again. And, that's the kind of work that I get to do, whether it's a startup or a philanthropic project, a collaboration with a giant company, or just something I'm doing on my own. It's been finding those kinds of experiences that they ought to happen. So of course someone should build an AI for diabetes. We may talk about some of the other ones, but of course someone should build an AI to predict manic episodes in bipolar sufferers. It's one of the worst mental health burdens on individuals and society, and yet we still just tend to shrug our shoulders and not do nearly as much as we ought to about it. And for that matter, of course, we should figure out why it is educational equity. We put a lot of lip service behind it, and yet it doesn't happen. So occasionally, I guess you need a mad scientist to come along. The world desperately needs self-appointed, rich white ladies to come along and save everybody. But there's a point at which you just have to say, I can make a difference. And I'm going to try, and it's not for me to decide how everyone else decides to make use of what I invent, but I can at least do the work that I can do and make it available to people.
Right. Yeah. So that's an engaging story.
I put you to sleep. So engaging.
No,
it's no. I'm doing my magic to, you know, tame a bear.
I'm usually like thinking ahead, like, okay, well, what am I going to ask next? And I was just like kind of lost in the story. It's like, you know, but yeah, I mean, I see that you post a lot. Like every time I go to LinkedIn, I just have to scroll down just a little bit, and there's a post from you about something, and it's always really interesting. You know, so you cover a lot of different topics, but most
It's
of
one
them,
of the fun parts of my
yeah,
career, if you want, or just my life, is that, you know, I get to be a sort of professional pompous jackass, by which I just mean, you know, what I've learned how to do applies to a lot of different fields. And so whether it's solicited or just sort of self-motivated, I get the chance to work on an incredibly wide range of projects. To me, they're all about human capacity. But to most people, they're like, wait a minute, you have this company to take bias out of hiring, but didn't I read about you doing that diabetes thing? And yes, I do both of those. And again, not because I'm some you know, unrestrained genius, but I just have the freedom for the good fortune of at least the latter half of my life to invest myself in things that I think really matter. And to be honest, I feel like some of the most productive work I've ever done is translational. Like I said, with the diabetes thing, there was an algorithm that had already been developed in computational neuroscience that I just ported right over. It needed some changes, had to get it into differential space and whatever. But, you know, every time I enter a new field, there's a learning curve to get some expertise in that field so I can have a difference. But there's also this immediately then this sort of hyper productive moment where everything I've learned how to do before that feeds into seeing the problem space differently. Why did no one ever build an AI for diabetes before? Because to be honest, if you talk to an endocrinologist, who of course aren't experts in machine learning to start with, but if you talk to them, they'd say, but there's nothing to predict. We know the biophysics of insulin release. We understand the timing of digestion. What's left? But then I'm a mom, and I'm collecting all of this data that probably most people, not no one, but most people don't collect. And I can see my son's blood glucose levels go up and down day by day. Well, he's already in kindergarten, so I'm not with him during the day, but I realized I could see how his day went just by looking at his blood glucose levels. So what to them is labeled as, you know, milligrams of glucose per deciliter of serum blood is, to me, oh, he was high right before lunch, they pre-dosed him, then he waited too long and he went low, and his whole afternoon was ricocheting and you know, the stress that comes from that. So, you know, I got to bring not a novice mind to the problem, right? I knew how to do certain things. So I got to bring the expertise of these other experiences I had as a neuroscientist, as a machine learning person. I knew how to actually program up the app and hack these systems because I was stupid enough to have started an educational technology company that no one wanted to fund. So I had to build the initial products myself. I am not an engineer and I always pity the real engineers that have to take over my coding projects. But I learned enough to actually build an app. And so I had these things I knew how to do. And I got the textbook on endocrinology, and I'm certainly not an expert on that, but I learned enough that I could make a difference. And every new project has that same moment where, boy, sometimes it takes months, sometimes it takes years to build the expertise in a domain. But at some point, suddenly things accelerate because I can begin to make connections that people hadn't made before.
Because you have both that diversity of knowledge and depth of knowledge, right? You know, so I talk about creativity in my classes, right? That the novelty of an idea is that, you know, the distance of, you know, the the knowledge, right? And the usefulness of an idea is that depth of knowledge. So when you said, why has nobody thought of this before? Well, it's because you didn't bring these two, nobody else had these two combinations of knowledge to come up with this perspective.
Yeah, and a friend of mine, Tom Malone, who's a professor at Sloan at MIT, just had a paper come out in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Science, and it is about the factors that predict collective intelligence in a team or some generalized community, some group of people. And I don't mean to undermine it, but in a funny sense, his three big findings are things we've seen the evidence before. But he did this really well at scale and looked at all these factors at the same time and really, like, to me, closed the book. One thing is individual level intelligence does not predict collective intelligence. It's not that you don't want smart people working on hard problems with you, but it just turns out that if they lack these other things I'm going to mention, they're probably better working alone. They don't add much value to a team that's collaborating. So the two other biggest factors, there were other findings, but the two other biggest factors, and the number one is diversity. We can think of it as diversity in broad terms, absolutely, cognitive diversity and so forth, but let's not shy away. Of course, it's racial and ethnic diversity. And in fact, he specifically calls out gender diversity. Everything else being equal, the best teams are nearly universally 50-50 male and female when it comes to collective intelligence. And then the last one, even though we're talking about intelligence, and we can measure the cognitive capacity of a team in a very similar way to the way we'd measure cognitive capacity of an individual. I already said the cognitive capacity of the individual doesn't predict the team, but what does are social and emotional intelligence. So when you sort of look at the average emotional intelligence of the group, my ability to understand the other people. So I don't mean that kind of self-directed emotional intelligence, resilience, growth mindset, all incredibly valuable. I mean your ability to understand, perspective taking. When that is high in the group and you have a diverse group, turns out better to have some moderately clever people with those two qualities, better by far than to have a team of asshole geniuses that, I remember my first experience at grad school, I showed up a little bit early, but like the first formal day of grad school was actually a rafting trip. I don't know why people think these things are important, but so all of these grad students from across all of the departments at Carnegie Mellon, we all take a trip to West Virginia and we go out on this river. I have never seen so many rafts spinning in circles for multiple hours as I have seen on that day. I just again, you fill a raft full of a bunch of geniuses, and because it's Carnegie Mellon, at least 80% of them are in the School of Computer Science, and it's just everybody's kind of doing their own thing, and it doesn't work. And so, bringing in diversity, understanding the other person, having the trust. I just wrote a paper on innovation, both a research, but hopefully one that's accessible outside the discipline. And my number one conclusion is innovation is about finding this healthy tension between trust and diversity. If I don't trust you, I'm not going to say what I truly believe. I'm not going to share an idea with the team if I don't think you're going to hear me. But if it's super high trust, the easiest high trust environment you get is everyone's just best friends. They all think the same. They all come from the same background. Maybe even they look differently, but they're really not bringing anything new to the table. And in fact, super high levels of trust. This is one of my favorite findings in doing that review paper. It was, even if you look at the most elite labs in science and the collaborations they have, as those collaborations age, they are just as likely as any other lab. Perhaps in fact, some ways they're more likely to preserve a collaboration over time than lesser labs. But the interesting thing is the only thing those older collaborations predict is more papers. but in fact, the actual innovation, the novelty of their research, its impact on the field, all go down. So they're even more susceptible in a way. We can get into why, but to this trick of, I really want to stay in safe waters. I don't want to live in the tension of these relationships. I don't want to have to break in new collaborative relationships. But that's productive innovation.
Right. But it's also there's not a lot of new knowledge being brought in, right? There's only so many, combinations of knowledge that you can explore, right? And that's why I just, I taught a managing diversity class this last year, and was explaining, they talk about, how important it is to be, have diverse, and that you'll have better, results and all that. And the simple explanation I gave was because just, oversimplifying creativity, right, is that, like I said before, the creativity is a generation of novel and useful ideas. Novelty is the distance, and right, and the useful is the depth. But then going a step further and saying, what your knowledge is from all your experience. And there's no two people on earth who have exactly the same experience, right? So no two people on earth have the exact same full set of knowledge. If you were able to extract everything, right, there would be no two people with exactly the same set.
Yeah, and so in fact, there's kind of interestingly enough, we found multiple contexts that on the surface might sound very different, but all in essence suppress innovation. For example, one of those things is using strongly hierarchical knowledge resources. So if I want to find a book at the library, knowing it's in the French literature section, and I can find, it starts with the letter F, and, I can identify that thing. And I don't want it to just be randomly next to a Dr. Seuss book. But it turns out people are almost immediately more innovative. Forget having alternate structures, literally just taking all the structure away and presenting them with random material. So that's one case that seems so desirable. Easy, fast access to general knowledge. Same thing for past solutions. Easy, fast access to past solutions. Densely connected social networks. And I came across a lot of people, even in the scientific community, saying, it's great. We want everyone densely connected because then everyone gets to learn the best ideas from, the brightest people. Turns out that never happens. Which again, instead is what's called satisficing. So those very densely connected networks can very quickly find good enough solutions, much faster than sparsely connected or disconnected groups. But the problem is, once that densely connected network finds that satisficing solution, it quickly spreads through the whole network, and people stop bothering to look for better ideas. And so it speeds up the process of discovery, but doesn't just slow down. It very much retards the discovery of bigger, more impactful innovations. And so we see this thing happen again and again and again. And it's interesting to understand the full dynamics. Absolutely. One of them is diverse teams literally bring more unique information. And because information itself is interpreted and has different connections in people's heads, all of that is powerful. But interestingly, other things happen as well that also kind of have to do with trust. So two people that are very similar, I pitch an idea at you, and I'm progressively just like you. I mean, my intestinal flora and fauna is similar. I smell the same. Turns out same-sex, non-romantic couples form faster relationships, faster positive relationships if they smell more similar. So we have all these qualities, all these dimensions on which we might identify similarity, or as nerds like me call it, homophily. And it turns out what happens if someone very similar to me pitches an idea, my brain kind of treats it like it was my idea. I don't really want to question it. I actually want to support it. I get literal rewards in my nucleus accumbens and dopaminergic rewards for trusting that other person's idea. So I don't give it an appropriate level of skepticism. I mean, it's an awkward way of putting it, but one of the values of diversity in as a team is genuinely that we're more skeptical of one another. Because we need to be when we're exploring ideas. Is this really a good idea? Is it actually going to solve the problem? Are we certain there isn't a better idea out there? A team that is very high in homophilia, which sounds dirty, but not in this case. You know, they are very good at finding quick and easy solutions, and very bad, relatively speaking, at really finding the best ideas. And part of it is that weird tension, again, between trust. So, and yeah, diversity of knowledge sources, diversity of socioeconomic backgrounds, diversity of expertise. I'll say this as someone that works on big, complex problems. You know, if you think you can hire a brilliant machine learning person and somehow their AI is going to figure your problem out for you, you are about to be really disappointed. And if you're not about to be disappointed, then you're going to be profoundly disappointed a couple of years from now when you discover that it's actually made everything worse. You need domain experts across multiple disciplines. So again, it is a high dimensionality of diversity that we're looking for. But I also always want to come back to, and absolutely that has to include cultural diversity and racial and ethnic diversity and so forth. All of these are incredibly rich and sort of productive parts of this whole experience.
Yeah, and lately you have recently, and it's not, somewhat diversity related, is the index, right? Where you're looking at, you know, the what is it, the you know, the number of startups by gender and LGBTQ status.
So you know, obviously I've gone out and started my own companies, and it turns out venture capitalists not super excited about founding an ed tech company before Coursera and Khan Academy. So no proof points. Well, education doesn't actually make money anyways, but you know, no startup land version of proof points, which is you can get a lot of funding. So no proof points that ed tech is a viable thing, founded by a couple of married women. And the interesting, I could toss in other things about me, which would make them even less interested in investing. But it turns out that was all they needed to know. It was funding my first company was brutal. Just people loved the technology, but nobody thought that I could be the one that did it. I will now mention again, I've founded 6 companies. I've been the chief scientist at a few others. I sit on the boards of a bunch of companies. I think maybe I had some potential somewhere along the way there. But I had that experience, and it's exaggerated my experience there by the fact that I'd actually founded a company like 15 years prior to that. A film company. I mean, no one should invest in movie making ever for any reason. It's you know, especially not from someone who had no film experience, who had actually just flunked out of university. And even if you didn't know that, I didn't have any degrees. I mean, keep in mind, that second company I founded, I had multiple PhDs. I mean, it was an amazing thing. We had, again, AI that everybody loved. But that first time around, I got the funding, and the second time I didn't. And it's hard for me to look at my life and say, the only advantage I had the first time around, the only advantage is that I was a man the first time. And in between that, I'd gone through gender transition while I was an academic. And, you know, it was amazing. Everyone said, oh, you're Vivienne now. That's terrific. What they didn't say, but I found out exactly the same day, was, oh, that means you don't know how to do math anymore. And, you know, you can't be the CEO of a company anymore.
Yeah,
so,
somehow
you know,
they took that out of you, right?
Yes. You know, it's funny, like genuinely the first day I ever showed up in my own lab, this is just the last day anyone ever asked me a math question. And so I had this experience. And yes, eventually our company found traction. But again, no one would fund us in education. So we had to move, we had to pivot, as they say. And I hated the pivot. So we sold the company. But first time out, I got a sale. So track record, everything after that was easier. But how many people give up, you know, because they hit that wall and the thing they know is the right thing to do, no one will fund and no one believes that they can do it. And unfortunately, they believe them. Because why wouldn't they? These are the pros.
Right.
And, you know, literally people told me, you know, you need to get a man to be the CEO because no one's going to take you seriously. A VC said he would invest if he gets to choose the CEO. And we weren't allowed to do education. So, you know, having had that experience, I wanted to document what that meant, whether we were talking about female entrepreneurs, queer entrepreneurs, and boy, this is a suitcase term, but Hispanic entrepreneurs. But the reality is, you know, Mexican American and Cuban American and Puerto Rican and you know, understanding the diversity of all these populations, even, you know, LGBTQ entrepreneurs isn't one, you know, being gay and being a lesbian, like these are two wildly different experiences out in the world. And then, of course, being transgender, completely different as well. Turns out, again, VC is not so thrilled when crazy people wearing the other gender's clothes walk into their offices and demand $6 million. But, you know, I wanted to document first off, what was actually going on. You know, our collective idea of who an entrepreneur is has been imprinted on our mind from the story of Microsoft and the story of Facebook. And, you know, it's a sort of nerdy but cutthroat, skinny white kid from Harvard who then drops out. Like that's literally encoded in our mind as part of the equation. Turns out, no, being a dropout from any university is not a good predictor of startup success. But it's so deeply ingrained in the mythos that we have, that's like Hollywood central casting's idea of who an entrepreneur is. Well, first thing I wanted to just document that wasn't true. Yes, the entrepreneurship rates, and when I say entrepreneurship, let me be clear, I have enormous respect. My father was an entrepreneur. He was a doctor that ran his own office. You know, people that start restaurants, I thought about doing that once. I love food. But that's not the kind of entrepreneurship we're talking about. We're talking about Schumpeterian, high growth, disruptive entrepreneurship. The kind of thing, it's a little like art, you know, I can't tell you what it is, but I know it when I see it. You know, we sort of understand if your intention is to address a global billion-dollar market, you're probably in that space. But if your intention is to start a couple laundrettes, you know, in your town, even if someday it explodes and it becomes this giant thing, that wasn't really that isn't the kind of entrepreneurship we're talking about. And a good proxy for that is, do you have venture backing or angel backing, or just did you convince someone that this could go big fast? So this is what we were looking at. It's what I was engaged in my own entrepreneurship. And it's what I wanted to say. Yes, women are much less likely to engage in that kind of entrepreneurship than men. In many cities, you know, in some cities, there's, you know, 19, 20 male entrepreneurs for every female entrepreneurs. And interestingly enough, in some, a big swing the other direction. In, what was it? Burlington, Vermont, for reasons I couldn't really tell you about, the female entrepreneurship rate is nearly 30% of the total population, up from 5% that I was referencing early. Most cities, San Francisco, New York, for example, about 10%. So clearly this is something women do much less, but that doesn't mean they don't have an impact. So how many jobs were created by female entrepreneurs? How many patents exist in the world for whatever, drugs, algorithms, that would not have existed had a woman not created that company? And yeah, we look at economic activity, funding rounds, and exits. And so we can actually track that in real time. In every major metro in the US and Canada. I 100% want to expand it around the world, but this is, for perhaps obvious reasons, easier to get data on these spots. In fact, probably what we'll do is slowly roll in places like London and Tel Aviv and Singapore that are sort of global standouts in entrepreneurship, rather than just arbitrarily roll into new countries. But we have the existing Northern North America profile in our system. And we can look and see how many jobs were created by women in Minneapolis. And that gives you some sense, not just of the sort of missing story of LGBTQ entrepreneurs in Minneapolis or women in Houston, but also some deeper stories, like how does that vary by industry? How does that vary by the size of the city, or whether you're in the South or in Western Canada? We can look at all the data in all these different ways to see what might be driving these outcomes. But then here was my real ambition, which we were able to begin to build into the system. So it's there, but what could it be? It's one thing to say, women created 1 million jobs in the US over the last couple of years, but what could they have created? Right. And I didn't want it to just be an exercise in, well, there are equal numbers of men and women in the world, and so we'll just imagine identical outcomes. Right. Let's make this, even if it slightly breaks my heart, let's make this realistic. Let's find the 3 cities in the world throwing out outliers that are the best performers for female job creation, for female funding rates, and so forth, and say, if those cities can achieve it, not just one city, but 3 cities, best in class, throwing out outliers, if they can achieve that, any city should be able to achieve that, at least scaled for their city. So, obviously St. Louis is smaller than New York City. New York is a pretty good city for female job creation. So if we took what we modeled on, New York and certain other cities in terms of job creation, and took that model and then applied it to St. Louis, what would it look like? And adjusted for other factors. And immediately we see that women created 1 million jobs, but even just with the best in class model and ignoring a perfect world, there are another, 5-10 million jobs we could have had over the last few years that didn't happen. And by the way, of course, unsurprisingly, the last year, 18 months, has been particularly bad for early stage startups. And so not only do we see the general finding, which has been found in past sort of moments of uncertainty. Right. It's a little awkward calling it a recession just because it's so unusual. But if we just look at moments of uncertainty around the world, it is always the case that money moves towards sure bets. VCs shift their money, then their funding, towards existing large entrepreneurial investment opportunities. Internally, companies invest in really safe incremental innovation instead of risky innovation during uncertainty. Probably not a great strategy, by the way, but nonetheless, this is a trend that happens. Right. But it disproportionately hurts female entrepreneurs, ethnic minority entrepreneurs, sexual minority entrepreneurs, for 2 reasons. One is because, of course, they are underrepresented in those mature startups. And, we pretend like Uber is a startup, but oh my goodness, the amount of additional funding that companies like that brought in during the pandemic is kind of obscene. We just keep throwing money at these things. They're these sort of zombie companies that never have to settle on a really sustainable business plan because they can always go raise another round. Right. And that in that rounds, not just for them, but for many organizations, took money away. I mean, literally took money away that would have gone towards early stage startups and disproportionately towards sort of more inclusive startups, as you will. But it's not only that, of course, someone like me, just as I experienced, geez, it was a long time ago now, but doing my first tech company, I'm seen as risky. So not only is my company risky because it's early stage, I'm risky because I don't fit their model,
Right.
because I'm different than what their head tells them an entrepreneurship will look like. It doesn't matter whether they're conscious that they're making this assessment or not, they make it. So they look at a woman and who's like me, who is starting their first real company, and they say, she's not experienced. And then a guy comes in that doesn't have my 2 PhDs, doesn't, at the time, doesn't have my algorithm. And they say, wow, that guy's got tons of potential. They're saying the same thing. Neither of us have started a startup before. But for me, that's held against me. For him, it's recast as being a strength. I'm a hard number scientist. I don't want to just shoot off and say, God, the world is unfair. I want the numbers to back it up. And we can see this trend of this sort of exaggeration of funding rates, this disproportional funding rates getting even more exaggerated during the pandemic, just because, of course, we weren't planning to, but because we launched it just as this was taking off. But yeah, boy, another super long answer for you, but we've been able to launch this thing. Our next big goal, and we just got funding support for this. Normally I pay for everything myself, but we have a nonprofit partner that went out to the JP Morgan Chase Foundation and said, let's figure out not just how to measure the job creation and all these things. Let's figure out what changes that. Let's figure out what policies and programs actually make a difference.
Oh yeah.
There's over 100 metros in our system right now with updating data every month. They all, have accelerators. They have differing tax laws, which, by the way, entrepreneurs don't care about. Why would I care? I'm not making any money. I don't pay any taxes. Right. They have different strategies in how to create an innovation culture that supports high growth entrepreneurship. Well, not only what makes a difference generically, because we have all the data on all startups as well. And so we can look at every entrepreneur just as easily as we can look cross-sectionally at, Black trans women entrepreneurs. But of course, what I want to understand is also what city doesn't want more jobs. Well, here's what Houston ought to do to help its own female population, the women that want to go start companies, help them flourish. And, I can give an answer to you because it's an interesting discovery. Houston and even though they have very different industries, Houston and San Diego look very similar. Women there are actually crazy successful. You may not, on the surface, expect Houston to be really competitive for women just because of assumptions about Texas or the energy industry. But it turns out individually, women in Houston are killing it. But the entrepreneurship rate of women in Houston is very low. Same thing in the biotech industry in San Diego. So our number one recommendations there are, you've already got a recipe for success. You just need to figure out how to share it. How do we drive more women into creating new things?
So it's a few women, but highly successful, which is like the opposite of what we have here. In Charleston, South Carolina, we have very high rate of startup, especially among African-American women, but very low success, in terms of profit.
Yeah. And so we see all these variants, and that's just two obvious directions, which is how how is the population performing? How are individuals performing? You know, these various comparisons, what are the rates? But I want to get all the way down to, you know, do accelerators actually make a difference for Black female entrepreneurship? And if they might, what would particularly make them effective?
And that answer actually would be very interesting to somebody who's here, was actually my speaker yesterday in class, is Erica Harvell. She's a founder of Nodat, which is a startup in Nashville. And she also has started an accelerator or incubator, right?
Yes, yeah. And I will say, first off, I think that you are amazing, and everything that that you're talking about right now, I can relate to, especially like during the pandemic and seeing all of these companies, you know, from young white male founders who had less traction than I did, who were building products for small businesses, get funding. And I've been building my company since 2017, sitting here at 30,000 users and, you know, 1,400 business on my platform, and being told that I need more traction. And it's because I'm a Black woman. I don't look like the status quo. And so when you said, and I wrote down what you said, no one thought that I was the one that could do it. Like, I keep hearing like, oh my God, this is the perfect thing. This is what the market needs. But what they're not saying to me is, but you're not the one, you know, who can actually pull this off. But in answer to your question about the accelerators do make a difference. But they're starting to become so, for when it gets to women and minority founders, there's accelerators are a dime a dozen. The one thing that they are missing is coming with the actual funding or the hands-on help to get that, so that person could take that curriculum, that information that they're learning, and actually put it into action for their businesses.
And that would be, I mean, it feels like such an obvious thing to say that we need to understand these things, not just in an abstract scientific way, but like so that you can make a decision. So my goal with the Inclusion Impact Index is for a mayor, for local financial institutions and investors, for economic development offices, for an accelerator to just say, like, here are 3 things that, you know, truly to your city that you should be doing that would make a real difference, for specific to a population, specific to your city. Because, you know, what Charleston needs is certainly not what San Francisco needs. Although San Francisco, let me tell you, has lots of problems. We got far and away the most entrepreneurs, because everyone thinks they're going to come here and strike it rich. But, you know, women dramatically underperform compared even to Sacramento. I mean, I could virtually, if I had a good wind behind me, I could probably get a Nairobi all the way to Sacramento from here. So just go to this forgotten city that most people don't, where is that? It's the capital of California. In most states, it might be the biggest city in the state, but here no one thinks about it. Turns out women there get more funding than men. They dramatically outperform women in San Francisco. So in essence, what I'm getting at is both cities are different and they're going to need their own support, but also learn from them. What really works? I do want to shout out one thing though for, you know, Nashville, well, Tennessee in general is, I was kind of shocked to see when we look, so our threshold, and is admittedly an arbitrary one, but we just needed some kind of a threshold. Our threshold to include a metro is that you had at least 50 funded entrepreneurs in the city. And but almost, we know for a fact, of course, that entrepreneurs from underrepresented backgrounds are more likely to have self-fund things. And so they're not going to pop in our data sets as much, but we needed to be able to make some decisions somewhere. But you look at this little belt of sort of like North Carolina and Tennessee, and both states have 4 cities in our index. And I was really genuinely shocked that we see that much diversified entrepreneurial activity across those 2 states. You look at every neighboring state, and it's almost always, even Georgia is a pretty big economic powerhouse, but only Atlanta is in our index. Again and again, all the way around those 2 states, it's really just one city that really is the heart of entrepreneurship. But in these 2, we see this diverse. But even there, Nashville, it wasn't Nashville. I'm blanking. What city is?
Is it Memphis?
I think it might be Memphis. One of the 4 is particularly good for women. And one of the 4 is particularly good for entrepreneurship, even compared, to other more traditional entrepreneurship sites, but they are different. So I think it was Nashville that has a fair amount of entrepreneurship going on within it, but women seem to underperform in Nashville. And I really started to dig into it. And one of the things we see that something similar in New York and LA and in Austin. And there's a lot of reasons for it, but one of the underlying causes is the entertainment industry. You'd think that it would be more inclusive by its nature, but it's not, particularly for women. And the reason is because it turns out hierarchical industries, whether they're formal hierarchies like banking or implicit hierarchies like entertainment, if a very small number of people get to make all the decisions, that industry is bad for female entrepreneurs. And so I think that's part of what is making Nashville hard for female entrepreneurs. It's not that there are none, but it underperforms compared to some of the other cities. And it's interesting to see that commonality and think, well, again, what are the ingredients here? If I wanted to break open an industry, like entertainment or like banking, that's also not great for women, then that's one set of policies and programs I want to run. If instead I want to lean into an industry which is already good for women, like biotech or AI, then that's a whole different strategy. Austin has a lot of AI and biotech. It's not so great for women. So one way to go with the flow and run programs that support women in those spaces. But another is we really need to open some of these industries up, because it's absurd that the supposedly liberal industry of entertainment is bad for women. Or some interesting flips, which is obviously what I call sort of the ghettoization of industries, which is, oh, you're Black, so you must be in entertainment, and you couldn't possibly be starting a company someplace else. You're gay, so it's got to be a lifestyle company. You can get more funding than the average entrepreneur if you go with the flow and you fit their stereotype. But if you push against it, then you get less funding. And then that, of course, creates a spiral where, okay, I believe you. You say you're an entrepreneur and you're starting a music company. Okay, I'm in with that. But you tell me I'm starting a biotech company and I won't give you any money. And so we see all of these complex things going on, and it's fascinating. It's going to require a lot more to really deliver, but our goal is by July of next year, we're going to have our new policy platform up and running. We're going to look at the causal linkages between local policy and actual success.
We're working with Stillman College right now here in Nashville. So Nashville, Birmingham, Memphis, and Houston, to kind of figure out, like, what do these 4 cities need to build a tech hub for Black high growth entrepreneurs. And so, like, I would definitely love to connect with you to even just see, like, how, you could even work with us, like with Stillman, or we can share what the data that we have. I
would love it. Absolutely. I would love it. Trust me, I'm So excited at the opportunity. I get a lot of invitations to come chat with people in London and Johannesburg, but having the chance to go to Tennessee, it's not that it never happens, but you know, and a lot of local politicians are very focused on things like, well, that sounds like a nice to have problem. I just want to get a new factory into town so we can create some jobs. And I'm like, but this is the thing that will create high paying, sustainable jobs in your city. You know, California, there's this big story about how California net loses jobs. But what we trade is call center jobs. And what we bring in are engineers and designers. Like, that's a trade that California is happy to make economically almost forever. We need, and now I'm, you know, the pompous jackass talking about the future of work, but people like me are building AIs to do as much of the routine labor as possible. And in fact, automation, just a new big paper out from Darren Acemoglu, is a big time labor economist at MIT. You know, he has this new paper out and shows increasing automation increases economic disparity. We need to get out of the mindset that the only thing to do to make our economy more inclusive is to create more shitty jobs for people. So they get stuck in that kind of thing, and they can never really afford to buy a house. And no, we need to create great jobs for people. And we need a world in which you are seen for what you're truly going to bring, and you're going to actually bring value to that job. All right, I don't want to get up on a soapbox all of a sudden, but you know, this is a long-term sustainable strategy in a way that, you know, bidding down tax breaks for you know, Amazon distribution centers is just never going to bring into your local center. And again, like, also to solve problems, we just need people for every good reason that see the world differently to be able to help solve more problems. So I invented some crappy AI to treat diabetes. That's not a cure. But I will tell you with absolute certainty in my heart, there have been a dozen kids born around the world that have the capability of coming up with a cure for diabetes. But the overwhelming likelihood is they're born someplace where they will never have the chance to live that life. And so they're never going to have the chance to transform my kid's life. And yet we get so caught up in a world, I mean, all of us do to some degree, and some of us do as a political philosophy, that it's zero sum or negative sum game. And if your kid's better off, then my kid must be worse off. And having done a lot of work in education, boy, I mean, that is genuinely a hard held belief in a lot of people's minds. And it just isn't true. You know, almost no matter what I do, despite the diabetes and autism, my son's going to have an amazing life. In fact, I'm quite confident. I mean, even in a hard number sense, the thing I could do that would improve his life the most is make certain some kid down the street from me in Oakland has the same shot as he does. I used to say this when I really ran some education companies. If I had the money to send my kids to a private school, I should take it and send some other kid to a private school instead. Frankly, where I live in Berkeley, the public schools are pretty damn good. I really love the fact that my kids are part of the largest ethnic group in the school, which is mixed. You know, there's some amazing kid out there, not just one, but more than I could possibly ever hope to send off to school, for whom that scholarship would truly make the difference in their life. It's not going to make that big a difference to my kids. And yet people stack the deck to make certain their kid goes to an Ivy League school and gets a job at McKinsey and ends up having no more or less influence on the world than they probably would have had anyways. When, God, we should see, again, I'm climbing up on a soapbox, and, you know, but this is, for me, this is something that's worth taking every dollar I make every year and putting it back into that purpose. I've got nothing against being stinking rich. I know how I'd spend $1 trillion tomorrow. It just happens to be that I spend it doing this silly idea that, if we can expand human capacity as much as possible, I'm just an investor. I'm investing in a future that I think is best for me. And some people think it's a little kooky, but by the way, they probably have a good read on me. I am pretty weird.
Well, we always need more weird.
Yeah.
We always do, but one of the reasons I put professional mad scientist on my LinkedIn is, one, it would seem like false advertising if I called myself CEO and I created the impression that I was a grown-up and responsible. But the real reason is I used to get a lot of inquiries from people. Hey, could you be the chief scientist of our company? When I say people, I mean like Netflix and Amazon. And it was never worth my time. One, because, Jesus, I do not want to be alone in a room with Travis Kalanick at Uber. Amazon was the greatest job pitch anyone has ever made me. In 7 years, we'll be a 1 million person company. Your job will be to make their life better. I have never bothered actually going and talking to someone about being a chief scientist, but I flew up to Seattle. I met with everybody. Jeff's definition of better life is not the same as mine, but I actually offered to do the job for free. Same responsibilities, same stuff. I don't really need the money, but if I could make 1 million people's lives better, how could I say no? Turns out that was not a good enough incentive to have a crazy person loose in their company. So they said, let's think about the whole free chief scientist thing, and never called me back. So, I sort of learned it helps for me to just put that right there on LinkedIn, and then people trying to pitch me gnarly data problems that might make us all rich, no, just stay away. And the ones that come to me, and still a lot of big companies come to me, I don't care if I'm working with a parent or a big company. Is this aligned with a problem I want to solve? I'll do it for free. I don't care if someone benefits from it. But they only come to me if they're willing to work on the kinds of problems in the ways that I want to. And so it's sort of like the opposite of sort of camouflage, and it's like the coloring. I'm throwing up yellow jacket colors, just so you know, stay away. Unless you really want a yellow jacket inside your boardroom. Oh my goodness. I get a lot of people, even still today, boards asking me, big public company boards asking me to join their board, and it never goes anyway. They just genuinely don't want me doing governance over their organizations. I think I'm actually great at governance. Don't let me undersell myself. I would be great on your board, but they don't want someone who might actually say no to something. And yeah, I will say no at the drop of a hat if I don't think it's the right thing to do. So it's hard to find that space, particularly in the business world, where you're trying to balance a legitimate interest of making this economically viable. Jesus, forget all the fancy social good stuff. Just starting a company is hard. Making it work is brutally hard. One of the #1 personality predictors of successful entrepreneurs is resilience. In fact, it's one of the biggest far and away. It's hard work. If that's what you want to do, be proud of that. Don't sell me a social good story just because you think it would be nice marketing. Because a social good story means you will truly say no to a path that might actually lead to a $1 billion exit. That's what it means. Work that out in your head ahead of time. I'm not going to think ill of you if you say, I don't want to make that commitment. But, for example, you don't get to pivot on a social good venture. The purpose is to solve the problem. If your solution didn't work, you need to come up with a new solution, not take that solution to some place that will make you money.
Right.
So it's just a very different way of thinking about problem solving. And so I often give a talk to MBA classes, which has the somewhat provocative title of social entrepreneurship is bullshit. And it doesn't mean that companies don't do good. And boy, it certainly doesn't mean companies shouldn't act ethically. That's just table stakes. Of course, every company should act ethically. That's why we have ethics classes at business schools, which work perfectly. But rather, to whom are you beholden? Are you building, do you, your co-founders, your employees, your board, your stakeholders, do we all agree that what we are here to do is build an amazing company that will find market traction and solve an important market problem in the world? Great. Or do we all agree that we're here to do is end homelessness like polio? Like nothing. That is our only purpose. If we can't figure it out, then there's no reason for there to still be a company. If Google scoops us on this thing, not that I could think of a reason why they get involved in homelessness, that's awesome. How can we help? But that is the attitude for doing social good. Doesn't mean that that social good organization can't grow fast. It can't have a big impact. It can't have a robust revenue stream. But I guarantee you, there will be some time, some point in the lifetime of that company where those two needs, are we building a robust company or are we serving a social good, will come in conflict. And you have to know ahead of time what your choice will be.
Yep.
Everyone, in fact, involved has to understand ahead of time. And I don't just mean this, again, as like a soapboxing issue. Probably my most pseudo-famous company is Guild, where we used AI to try and take bias out of hiring. Turns out that's pretty hard. But nonetheless, I think we did about as well as anyone's ever done on that problem. And the problem is, despite that being our reason for existing, our 2/3 of our customers did not actually use our tools for that purpose. They really just wanted a really fast, easy to use applicant tracking system to help with their hiring. A third of them really used the very fancy, expensive AI that we built to find people that were different. Well, I said, we should go out there, it sucks, but raise another funding round, lean into those third of the people that really want to solve this problem and build a product that will be exactly what they need. And I had all sorts of ideas, and we built prototypes and so forth. And just understand it's going to take us an additional 5 years, but someday those companies will beat their competition. And it will prove to the world that that's what a high performance company needs. Turns out you can't win that argument when the two co-founders and the board all say, but 2/3 of our customers want a fancier applicant tracking system. So that's what we're going to do. Yeah. So I left, they built that. And instead of the IPO that we were heading towards, we had a very nice acquisition. But I mean, it was nothing close to what it could have been. But what it could have been would have been hard. It would have meant a sacrifice that didn't have to happen. But here's the real lesson. What happened was I left, and one of the most flattering things I've ever heard in my life, the head of HR took me out for a coffee a year later. And she said, I just wanted to let you know I'm leaving. I'm going to join the Lucas Foundation. My whole last year has been a series of exit interviews. Like everyone who was there when you were there, they're all gone. And the only reason anyone ever gave, and again, I am giving myself a huge pat on the back with what I'm about to say, but it felt so good to hear this. Without Vivienne here, we don't know why we're doing what we're doing. And so it really tore the company apart. One group, all of our language, all of our marketing was about solving the problem of bias in hiring. But when push came to shove, it was about the IPO. And that's the way the board went. That's the way most of the executive team went. And that meant I and most of the rest of our employees left because that wasn't why we were there. And it just robbed, even if you had wanted to have the IPOs and you believed 2/3 of our customers can't be wrong, so that's the right thing to build, then you had to have that understood ahead of time. Everyone had to agree. We're here for an amazing exit. And if along the way we do some good, that's wonderful. But that's not our true mission. Be honest about that with yourself. Because again, it's hard enough building a successful company. Don't make it harder on yourself by, you know, layering all of this language on it about what a good person you are. Build a great company. That has some real good on the world already, barring a couple of notable exceptions. But if what you really truly want to do is solve a problem, go solve it. I mean, the world's full of problems and no one's holding you back. You know, you want to work on bias in hiring? I don't need a VC to fund that. There's a ton of work you could do tonight working on that sort of thing. So, you know, it's a kind of a hard learned lesson. I mean, it was really sad to see the company never quite reach the potential it could have had in either direction. And I just learned ever since then, lean in hard to the thing you truly believe in, because being an entrepreneur is a hard job. Don't sell yourself illusions, much less anyone else.
When you were saying how people left because you left and that they didn't know why they were there, it just reminded me of the Simon Sinek talk about, you know, start with why. They believe what you believe, right?
It's a funny thing, as someone that gives a lot of talks nowadays, I've become a bit of a connoisseur. I also hate talks. And it's sort of a weird thing to get paid such an obscene amount of money to be on a stage rambling like a madwoman for an hour when I would never in a million years go to see someone else give a talk. But yeah, I mean, I've seen Simon's talk, and as staged as the delivery is, the spirit behind it, you know, start with why, then, you know, the how and the what begin to follow, is just, I write a lot now. I have new projects that start all the time. I have this sort of diversity of projects we work on. Every one of them starts with what we call a breaking session. And the absolute first question in the breaking session is, why are we doing this? And it's not my answer. Why are we doing this? The people in the room are the people that are going to work on this project. Sometimes it is just me, but often, you know, it's a half a dozen people from my team or someone else, and we're all getting together. Why do we agree that this thing should happen? What will be different about the world because we're going to put this time into it? Nothing else matters until we all agree. And there may not be one why, there could be a couple of them, but until we have that why. And then the next thing is, you know, what is the outcome? And then the funny thing is, then I go through an exercise that really is about like screenwriting and so forth. Who are the villains? Who are the villagers? Who's the hero? And don't assume it's us. Like, you know, we really work through framing this thing in a very story-driven way. And only then do we begin thinking about, well, conceptually, what is the problem at stake? What is the kind of solution that might make a difference in that problem space? We don't touch any of that until we've worked out these core why questions right from the top. So in that sense, yeah, it's a really engaging look at how to reframe this. And you could go through a lot of different ways, like the 5 whys, or, you know, why, how, what, or there's a number of exercises I think that really help in challenging your own assumptions about a project and taking it out. And a lot of people should. I was asked to work on an education project in Kenya. And while I was there working on it, a number of entrepreneurs would come to me and sort of pitch their ideas, none of whom were Kenyan. Or that's not true. A couple were Kenyan, but they're all South Asian Kenyan. So not a single Black Kenyan is pitching me an idea, which is already a serious problem. Because every one of their ideas is, of course, this sort of carpetbagger thing of like, did you know that all of these small family farms, desperately need insurance to cover their system? And I've built this amazing AI that will predict how well their crops are going to do, and we can sell them micro insurance. And I'm just like, first off, you're from Brussels. So I'm not saying you're smart and you don't understand what it means you don't understand anything about tea farms in Kenya, but, at least where's your co-founder who does?
Right.
But even beyond that, like a 5 why exercise, if you got an AI that will predict the outcome, or it can help them manage all the things they need to run their farm, and can increase their productivity 5 times, yet your marketing strategy is sell to the farm holder your software. They have to buy it from you, spend money on the maybe chance that your microinsurance is going to benefit them. If you know that you can increase their productivity by a factor of 5, then just lease their farm for a year at twice the expected productivity of their farm. Trust me, they'd love to. They can take that money, they can go do something else. I mean, a lot of these families feel trapped on these farms, like they can't get off because it's year to year. They'd love to be able to go to Nairobi and do something else, but they can't. And even if they get to Nairobi, there's nothing there for them. You could give them twice their average salary, drop of a hat, just like that, to lease that piece of land. And you want to build a wraparound that help them figure out what to do with the money, that's fine. But if you tell me you think you can actually increase productivity 5 times, why is that farmer having to take all of the risk, pay you money, and hope that your product will make a difference? If you truly believe your product makes a difference, you would absorb all the risk.
Right.
I noticed that you're not. So why is that? Do you really believe your product works? Or is the idea of doing microfinance in Africa the reason you're doing this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So you can tell where my personal belief about what that pitch is about.
Yeah.
And, far be it from me, like, I am the rich white lady in Africa trying to solve problems. So let me just say, I get it. You think you're a hero and you're going to come and save them from themselves. It's never going to happen.
Are you familiar with the Map the System competition out of Oxford, or work by Daniela Pappy Thornton, which she calls heropreneurship?
I'm not familiar with that terminology, but I bet I can intuit what it's about.
It's exactly what you're talking about. It's about, the kids out of Oxford think they understand the problem of the farmers in Kenya, and they go down there to make their solution, and they come back a year later failed because they had no lived experience. They did not involve the people who would benefit in the development of the solution. So the Map the System competition is a flip on the traditional social entrepreneurship pitch. Instead of pitching a solution, they're pitching their understanding of a problem through systems understanding.
I think I may have actually given a keynote at their annual conference. Tells you how awake and aware I am when I'm traveling around the world giving keynotes. But yeah, I mean, even microfinance, forget the entrepreneurship side of it. These are phenomenally complicated stories. If you're not involving the actual people, or if you haven't experienced it yourself, I've experienced homelessness. That is a problem that I understand. I know how scary it is to not know where your next meal is coming from. I wish more CEOs had that kind of experience. But essentially, microfinance has won 3 Nobel Prizes. If you're not aware, it's won a Peace Prize for the basic concept. It won the Economics Prize for the deep dive into that concept and the work on making it happen. And then it ran a relatively recent Economics Prize for showing that it doesn't help. Boy, isn't that, that isn't what it won. Like, they won it for their body of work doing empirical economics research, in this case in India, Batterjee and Dofu. But one of the main things they showed, and this is really interesting because it's microfinance for entrepreneurs. what they found, I think, says a story about entrepreneurship around the world. It turns out microfinance to allow, these small loans to allow people to become more entrepreneurial and go do something that they maybe wouldn't have done otherwise. 5 years afterwards, they look just like the people that didn't get the loans, with one exception. So that follow-up came up after they got the Nobel Prize. But isn't that disappointing? Like this wonderful thing that won these 2 initial Nobel Prizes doesn't seem to make the difference we thought it was going to make. But then they have this secondary finding. Actually, if we break it down and look at people by subpopulations, we find one population for whom it makes a profound difference. People that had already started their entrepreneurial journey. When the people that were doing the microfinance equivalent of being entrepreneurs, not because they got a loan or access to one, but they were doing it anyways. When they got a microloan, it made a huge difference 5 years, when you looked 5 years later. And it really says something, I think, in general about entrepreneurship and even our broader creative economy, which is, it's not enough to just stuff a loan down someone's throat or send everyone to university or teach everyone how to program. There are these other qualities that go into making the kind of person that's going to take this risk, that's going to found a company when the whole world tells you that you can't do it. And sure, some of these things have genetic ties, everything does to some degree, but resilience, I said, was a huge predictor in entrepreneurship. There are wonderful research looking at how you build resilience in individuals. So you want to make an investment in entrepreneurship that will really pay off. Yes, at some point, money is part of the equation, but the first investment is, how do I help make you more resilient? Actually, most research, a lot of us think that entrepreneurs are big risk takers. Turns out the real difference in risk profile for entrepreneurs is they have less risk. Either you already have a wealthy family, or often it's as simple as the reality that I have. I do this weird kind of entrepreneurship, which is this philanthropic entrepreneurship. So double the risk, you might say. It's all cost for me. And yet somehow it keeps moving forward and growing. But I know, genuinely, I know that if anything happened, I could go get a chief scientist job, and have all that money plus more back in my pocket within a year. So my risk of being an entrepreneur, even the weirdo kind that I am, is pretty minimal. So understanding these dynamics, understanding how personality and cultural context and so forth play in, it's those kind of investments that would make the most profound difference at a societal level. Right. If we're only looking at those people that already have those qualities, sure, money, access to capital makes a big difference. Giving some basic financial training, things like that. But there was this great study, in this case done in Nigeria, kind of in parallel to some of the microfinance research, that looked at whether, business training, and these were all very short things. So let's, like, boot camp business training, boot camp finance training, or in essence, resilience training or sort of socio-emotional training. Which of those made a difference? And the first two, no statistical difference compared to the control group 2 years later. But the ones that got the sort of emotional, socio-emotional, educational support, they were dramatically better off, much more likely to have their startups still in business 2 years later. And stuff like that keeps popping up in the entrepreneurial research literature. So again, even the ones that are willing to take the risk, there are things we could give them at a deep and personal level that would be so much more valuable than just, here's $500, pay me back or don't. As much as that plays a role at some point in this journey, it's never the starting point for making a big difference.
Yeah. Well, what you're talking about it just reminded me of a paper that I would have students read, which is the attractiveness of other people's problems, right? As looking at, looking at another country and saying, oh, well, look at that, there's an easy solution. And the article goes on to say, now turn that in reverse. Imagine that you are, from somewhere else and you look at the gun problem in America and you can find an easy solution, but realize, in context, it's a lot more complicated than it seems. If there was an easy solution, it would have been solved.
I have like these 3 posters behind me for upcoming books. There's a 4th one that just doesn't have space for it, which is, this is science fiction because I'm absurd enough to think that I can do all the stuff I get to do and write fantasy and science fiction on the side. But the 4th one, which isn't up here, is called Messy Human Problems. And it came from a line I just sort of threw out on stage once, which is, there are only ever messy human problems and they only ever have messy human solutions. It doesn't matter how smart you are. You are not smart enough to figure out what caused the gun problem in the United States, much less how to solve it. All of these things are more complicated. And one of my favorite examples has nothing to do per se with entrepreneurship, but it's the study that was done on the ban the box movement, which is something I 100% support, which is remove the box from job applications that says I've been convicted of a felony. Turns out it is not very predictive of anything about how good you are in the job. And you could, I guess, if you really felt the need to, you could have that, you could use that box if you work with kids. Like, we can find a compromise here if you feel this is truly important. But I'm just telling you, people checking that box or not doesn't tell you whether they're going to be good at the kind of jobs that they're going to be applying for. But what we do know is if they check the box, they won't get the job. Right. So this is true of anyone. It essentially just ruins the rest of your life, economically speaking. But of course, disproportionately, this affects young Black men in profoundly negative ways. So ban the box. And this is a perfect example of something that on its surface, oh my goodness, this seems like such an obvious thing. So Illinois was one of the first states to pass this law, and they did, and it was right to do so. And the total employment of Black men dropped. And of course, the problem is that we didn't understand the problem. We thought about, someone coined this term, but I'll be happy to print it in like it's actually mine, called possibilistic thinking. I can imagine a world where this solves the problem, and therefore it will. So I can imagine a world in which not having that box solves this bias in employment, and therefore it will. But actually, if you're a computational neuroscientist like me, a sort of Bayesian, your first question would be, how do people's judgments about a resume change when you take information away? Are we confident that that's actually going to change their judgments in the way that you think? And what actually ends up happening is, this is going to be a terrible, terrible truth, but it's a truth for understanding hiring in America. That box wasn't preventing the hiring of the young men that checked it. It was allowing the hiring of the young men that didn't. It told the potential hires, oh, I'm safe. You can trust me. Now that's ugly, but it is how people's minds. So I have this bias, which is, if you're young, you don't have a college education, you're applying for a low-income job, then if you're Black, maybe you've been convicted of a felony. It's just in my head as a possibility. So now this piece of information that would have told me that you're not, now I'm kind of treating every young Black man that doesn't have a college degree as maybe potentially they've spent time in prison, therefore I don't want to hire any of them. Which, again, it's an ugly truth that I wish wasn't the way that they're making the decisions. But if you want to actually solve the problem in a way that improves economic inclusion in Illinois, then it turns out only banning the box wasn't good enough. And in fact, even though it would be a very subtle effect, my genuine belief and bet is it actually probably improved hiring for young white men, because those few that might actually have checked that box and not be hired, now the default assumption is they probably didn't go to prison and therefore are more likely to get hired. So understanding the way our brains interact with this data doesn't make it right the decisions are being made this way. But if you truly want to solve the problem, you need to actually understand the problem. And these problems are, every worthwhile problem that deserves time and attention, every problem that doesn't have a solution, because if it was easy, it already would, is at least that complicated. And if you want to fix that equation, you need to figure out how to do the entire thing, because it is so easy to allow your good intentions to actually make the problem worse.
Yeah.
And we see that in a variety of different contexts in which good intentions like microfinance might actually, in many contexts, actually make the very problem you're trying to solve worse. And I would argue in agreement with you that a lot of this just comes from the fact that you didn't bother to actually collect a wide and diverse body of stakeholders that could work together on understanding what was really going on. And even then, have humility that even that collection of people may not have figured it out, and that we should really understand what's about to happen here before just telling everyone, yes, default credit swaps are great, they'll never go wrong. Our economy is infinitely robust, we can sell subprime mortgages forever. Whenever I hear people say, we couldn't possibly have known, that these things would cause an economic collapse, or we couldn't possibly have known that a massive social network could be used for disinformation, my response is, but you absolutely knew that you didn't understand the thing you were doing. And you did it anyways. At which point, some of the moral responsibility for the consequences is still there.
Yeah.
I'm not very satisfied with how could I have known. It's just we're all pretending to be grown-ups, so let's actually own that grown-up responsibility that I made a mistake, and I'm responsible for the consequences.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of reminds me of nuclear science, right? Trying to achieve energy, and then obviously turning it into a weapon. And then the thing people always say is that any good invention can be used for bad. So,
and I like to actually throw out other examples. You can get really pessimistic about this stuff, or holier than thou. My very first machine learning project was doing real-time lie detection off of raw video, sponsored by the CIA. Not the most noble endeavor ever. So I'm an undergrad, the CIA is funding this. It's open academic research, but it's unambiguous what they want to use it for. It was cool as hell. Like, my undergraduate honors thesis was a system that could figure out where your pupils in your philtrum was and could tell if you were smiling. I got hooked. That was my introduction to machine learning. All right, not so noble. And there's a bunch of really profound research showing how this is being used in the wrong way, in some parts of the world, used in the wrong way in the United States for policing. I mean, there's a company out there that's telling you that they can use it for hiring. As someone that's done both of these things, not one stitch of scientific evidence exists that says that their tool actually makes a positive difference. Almost certainly the exact opposite. So we shouldn't do anything with facial recognition. So here's where I like to say, no, AI is just a tool. All of technology, it's just tools. It doesn't mean that we have no moral responsibility for how we choose to use them, but that responsibility is ours. And if a tool has no benefit but to do the bad thing, then sure, it would be irresponsible to do stuff. But I actually got to take that thing I learned how to do for the CIA, and I got to work on 2 separate projects. I mean, I screw around with facial stuff all the time. That also sounded vaguely dirty. But in this particular case, facial analysis. So one of them, when I got this early version of Google Glass, I pitched a couple of ideas. One was a virtual EMT. It had just been the time of the Boston bombing. And I said, what if forget everyone, what if 10% of the people there were wearing Google Glass, and they could then immediately connect to an EMT and, using the camera here, pick up heart rates, essentially become a first responder, like right there in seconds. How many more people would be alive? They liked that idea. But the other thing I threw out was, we take this camera and I read your facial expressions, and there's all sorts of bad things I can do with this, not restricted to, although it turns out it doesn't work all that well, lie detection. But I could certainly recognize your face and pull up your Facebook profile or LinkedIn or maybe a credit score or something. But what if instead we built it for autistic kids so that they could learn how to read facial expressions, a very common deficit in autistic children. But instead of learning it as a cartoon face on a flashcard, they could learn it through actual social interactions with other people. And it turns out not only does it work better, but they also learn perspective taking, theory of mind at the same time, which is an amazing, unexpected additional consequence using facial recognition, facial expression recognition in this case. And another project I got to work on is really fun because it has a very long story that we don't have. It's already super late now that we probably don't want to dive into. But so I'll just tell you the punchline. We built this incredibly sleazy game called Sexy Face that promised to get you laid by you training the system on what faces you think are sexy. And then it confesses, this is just a Trojan. You're just helping us train up this project. Why did we lie to you? Because what we're actually doing is reuniting orphan refugees with extended family members. So the UN has a book with 1 million photographs in it. These are kids. I mean, this was like 2010 or something. But these were kids, in refugee camps. You can't imagine. I mean, genuinely, the vast majority of us cannot imagine what it would mean to be an orphan in a refugee camp, just across the border from your war-devastated home. And many of these places not far enough across the border, because there's these horrible stories, particularly in Uganda and elsewhere. So maybe you've got an uncle out there somewhere, but you're so little, how you don't remember the village you're from, whatever. So we built a system that instead of a book that the uncle just has to leaf through for days and days, we built a little thing on a tablet, and you pick the face that, the faces that you can see that look a little bit more like your niece, and it updates the screen. And if she's in a camp anywhere in the world, in about 3 to 5 minutes, you've found her. Again, facial recognition. And even worse, facial recognition trained up on human depravity. The complexity of what it means to be able to do something that's good really means for us to take some ownership of the consequences, good and bad, and ownership of, again, if this were easy to solve, we'd have already solved it. And let me promise you, AI will not solve it for you. AI can't take bias out of hiring. But if we can figure out something that does, AI can do a pretty amazing job of changing the economics of that solution. And there are things we know. For example, again, I mentioned resilience several times, big predictor of success in entrepreneurs. Turns out it's a big predictor of success in general employees as well. And it turns out Black resilient people, just as big a predictor as for white resilient people. Men as for women. So resilience is a general invariant predictor of quality of work. Now, people express resilience, though, often in very different ways. Some are culturally associated, some are just personality differences. Sometimes people are stoic. Sometimes they scream at the top of their lungs. The only thing that matters for resilience is when you fail, you push through and find success out the other side. That is the only meaningful description for resilience. People that have that quality are better employees, all other things being equal. And entrepreneurs that have that quality, that's entrepreneurship. You will fail. So you better be ready to push through and come out the other end, because otherwise you're never going to get anywhere. Building an AI that invariantly looks for resilience is a step in the direction of trying to tackle bias in hiring. Whereas seemingly much more ambitious, building a giant deep neural network that takes masses of hiring history data and predicts whether people get a promotion in their first year and then uses that to recommend hiring, it's going to recommend hiring a bunch of straight, wealthy, white males.
Right.
Because that is the overwhelming history of America. Right. And a deep neural network doesn't understand the difference between correlation and causation. So this one thing that sounds super cool, sounds like it could transform the world, actually makes the problem worse because it's even more biased than the data it was trained on. It's just a consequence of the mathematics of neural networks, or any kind of machine learning. Whereas the seemingly much more modest thing, we actually know from huge amount of research, the resilience or growth mindset or analogical reasoning, or we talked earlier about social skills, perspective taking. These are invariantly predictive of quality of work across gender, across race, across socioeconomic status. We know this already. Build an AI that makes it cheap and easy for people to identify that kind of quality while respecting, again, it's always hard, that people will express it in different ways. We're trying to understand something hidden about a people from the clues. Like, we need to build Sherlock Holmes that can piece together all of these little clues to build a rich story about someone. That is brutally hard. Have some humility about that. Bring in as many people as you can to help you understand that problem, and never assume technology is going to figure it out for you.
Yeah, you never know where the solution is going to come from. It could be from somebody studying mollusks or something like that, you know.
As it turns out, I ran an abalone farm in Santa Cruz, California for 2 years. I would argue, in fact, the funny thing is I did that just before going back to school. So people used to ask me why I study, neuroscience and brains. And I said, I spent 2 years studying the largest marine snail in the world. And I just immediately said, I need to go build some cyborgs. All right, so the path isn't nearly so direct there, but, really it was the lesson for me of running that abalone farm is, wow, you can't control everything. The world is a messy, complicated place. Do the best you can. As honestly as you can, and when life gives you the opportunity to go back to school, the one you flunked out of, just say thank you and move along. But that was honestly, someday I should write a book about Pacific mariculture. It's like a mashup of Lord of the Flies and Knives Out and the Milagro Beanfield Wars. It's just was quite an experience.
Wow. Yeah, that's interesting. But it does take me to something that popped in my head, I don't know, maybe an hour ago. But that, in learning from other solutions and stuff like that is the idea of biomimicry, learning what works in nature and adapting from that. Do you get involved in anything like that at all?
Well, I mean, obviously, a lot of the inspiration, not for artificial intelligence, I mean, all of the inspiration for artificial intelligence at some point was inspired by our understanding, if flawed, of human cognition. So as absurd as it might seem to think of it this way today, you know, the old school sort of if-then propositional logic that was the earliest days of artificial intelligence, turns out it could play chess and it could prove mathematical theorems. And so if you're Newell and Simon, you know, in the late 50s and early 60s, you're thinking, this is human intelligence. Turns out we're not. And that isn't how it works. And so a lot of AI has been this continuing series of thinking we got it figured out and then going back and looking deeper. One of the famous stories of the history of AI is this 1970s, where this group at MIT like sort of told itself, we're going to get human level intelligence this summer. We're just going to figure it all out. Turns out it didn't work out. And it's for the reason that, you know, one of my first neuroscience professors told me, which is problems you didn't know you had. When you look at mid-level perception, not just of humans, but of, you know, any animal, turns out it is astonishingly complicated. You know, there's an old Richard Feynman quotation, which almost certainly means he didn't actually say it, which is, if you can't build it, you don't understand it. By the way, that doesn't go the other direction. Just because you built it doesn't mean you understand it. But if you truly understand it, you should, at least in theory, be able to build it. And so we keep building these things that were what we thought was going on, and only to discover that they weren't. But in doing so, every time we really did solve a problem and advance the field, and eventually advanced it from science and engineering into actual application in the world. So when we could finally get to the level of, and again, it is too much to say that even a deep neural network is some sort of neuromorphic model of the brain, but it does certain things in computationally similar ways to certain parts of the brain. So very genuine, very general visual processing arguably has a lot of similarities to general purpose deep neural network visual processing. But it is a bit like, imagine you had an occipital cortex that does that primary visual cortex, but all the rest of it was gone. Maybe then you're sort of, there's a sort of mimicry there. But a lot of these things are fascinating and inspired. But you have to understand what it is you're trying to mimic. So I said I'd worked on this project doing one of the first machine learning systems for neuroprosthetics, cochlear implants in this case. So it's the oldest neuroprosthetic by far. Most other things like deep brain stimulation and motor neuroprosthetics for people that are paralyzed are still very new. But this has been around for a while. But it just was engineered. So in this case, they looked at what the ear does, and they tried to make an artificial system do the same thing. Turned out, I would argue, from papers I've published, that it isn't what you should do. Let's bring Simon back into this. Look at why the ear does what it does. Then realize that a cochlear implant is not an ear. You know, just for example, an ear has 30,000 different hair cells that are translating movement in your inner ear into electrical activity, action potentials in your brain, graded potentials in this case. And then that further expands into 30,000. So 3,000 into 30,000 and it expands greater. And by the time you get to the auditory cortex, enormous scale of processing. So, but a cochlear implant, certainly back in the day, but you know, because of processing constraints, power constraints in large part, it doesn't have nearly that many channels. You know, you might often, you know, the machine could have them, but the interface between the machine and the ear might have 8 good channels, which it can convey the entire auditory space of the world. And those channels are probably noisy and unreliable, So if instead of the what, literally what do the filters look like in the inner ear, and how can we just program those into a machine that does the same thing, a microphone? What if we said, why does the ear do what it does? And then train our very limited scope artificial system to solve the same why problem. Turns out it comes up with a different what, but it does so much better perceptually. So that was our big discovery. We didn't build a cochlear implant that continues to learn using the machine learning. What we were able to do is use the machine learning to discover an entirely new filter system that tries to optimize what our mammalian ears optimize, but optimizing it, understanding that the electrical system is different. You know, this artificial system is different than the natural one. And as a result, we increased speech perception by 50% in a set of experiments that we ran. So in that sense, it's biomimicry, but at the level of why, not at the level of what. And I think that's a really useful lesson for a lot of the things we might do, whether it's entrepreneurship or science or engineering, is understanding, again, why I'm doing what I'm doing, partially so I can translate that to the problem that I'm working on. So that whatever I've worked on before, I'm trying to grab all of these pieces and remix them for new problem space. I had this knowledge about machine learning and about brains, and then I had a kid with diabetes. Well, I didn't just take the original algorithm and apply it. I understood that I needed to make some changes so that the what of predictive coding in the retina, well, what was the actual why there? And then I want to abstract the algorithm then and come back down into diabetes and make a new set of predictions, understanding it's a different domain with different needs. And that really paid off. I didn't have to invent a new algorithm. I just needed to do some translating. And translating's hard and it's never perfect, but you know, that's what brought me success in that project. I didn't have to reinvent, but I did have to recontextualize the algorithm.
I haven't given students an opportunity yet to ask any questions. So do you guys have any questions? Looks like, Ben, you're trying to talk, but you're muted.
It looks like you might be trying to think very hard.
Oh, that too. There's been a lot to really, I'm going to have to definitely rewatch this for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine that many people experience spending a couple of hours with me the way I experienced my son just vomiting in the bathtub. It's somewhat torrential, and I don't fully understand why it's happening, and I might need a shower afterwards.
Oh, I loved it.
My daughter is telling me it's way past the time I was supposed to be done, and we're supposed to go take a walk. Have you guys had dinner?
We need to have a piano lesson today.
Oh, it's so you and Mama are going to piano? Thank you for all joining me in this conversation.
Oh.
Are you going to go right away? It's pretty soon, right?
Mm-hmm.
So I need to be responsible for Felix. Did you want me to go walk with you guys?
That would be fun.
That would be fun if I went and walked my daughter to her piano lesson. I think I might have to be a mom and go do that. I hope that's okay with everybody.
Absolutely. It's been a great pleasure having you. It's always great hearing you talk and talking with you, and just it may seem like vomit, but I love it. So
it may seem like vomit, but I love it. I should get a t-shirt. Can I quote that and put it on my page for people trying to book me for keynotes? My father used to wear a t-shirt that said, if you can't dazzle them with your brilliance, baffle them with your bullshit. It clearly sunk in. It was a blast. I love the opportunity to sort of explore some complex ideas in a big and open way. Obviously, it's a huge privilege just to be able to talk with people about the work that I do. And it's also fun having those conversations without people who are thinking one of two thoughts: how will this make me more money, or how will this help us destroy the enemy?
Right.
My first ever public event happened a few weeks ago. I was a judge at the U.S. Naval Postgraduate School pitch competition. As you might imagine, they pitch projects that are a little bit different than most pitch competitions. But the most important takeaway from the entire thing, now I know, literally and formally, where mad scientists ranks in the hierarchy of the U.S. military. And if any of you have a military background, I am truly embarrassed to say I rank above lieutenant general, and I do expect to be saluted. It was such a pleasure being here with you all.
Thank you.
And forgive me for having to run out so quickly, but it's been a blast.
Definitely kept you longer than you committed to. So thank you very much for sticking around so long.
Terrific. Drop me a line anytime. I'd be happy to come back. And
Yeah,
I would definitely love Erica to come out and visit you guys. I mean, again, truly what the world desperately needs is a good white person to go solve everybody's problems. And I am that person.
Yes, thank you.
So let me know. I would love it.
Will do. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Okay. Stop streaming. Stop.